Crimson Dragon is a rail shooter for the Xbox One. Now, if you're not sure what a rail shooter is, I can't say that I blame you because it's not exactly the most common genre these days. It's basically any game where you take control of a flying creature or flying aircraft and you fly through a level and it's on rails, meaning that you don't actually choose which direction to go to in a level. It's like a roller coaster ride basically. There's only one predetermined path. And you can shoot down things that are shooting you, so you can look around, but as far as where you go, you're just going in that one predetermined path. And when it comes to just pure fun, it's always been one of the best genres in video games. Unfortunately, it seems to have suffered the same fate as futuristic racing games, where it's a genre that used to be popular, but unfortunately isn't very popular anymore. So Star Fox 64 was amazing, and then on the original Xbox, there was Panzer Dragoon Orta, which for me is like the pinnacle of this genre by far. That game was fantastic. There was also Rez on the PlayStation 2, and then Rez HD on the Xbox 360. Absolutely phenomenal. If you still have an Xbox 360 and you still play that, that is essential. So when they announced a couple years ago that a new game from the team that made Panzer Dragoon was going to come out, I was thrilled. It was called Project Draco, and it was originally going to come out in the Xbox 360. And then it got delayed, and then they said, oh, it's going to be an Xbox One launch game. And I'm like, oh man. Not only that, it's going to be an exclusive, which was like, ugh. I was like, please let this be close to Panzer Dragoon Orta. Please let it be just as good. Please let it be like an HD Panzer Dragoon, please. And technically it is HD, and technically it shares a lot of similarities with Panzer Dragoon, and now that game is called Crimson Dragon. And if I had to describe this game in one word, it would be disappointing. I guess it was just too much to hope for to be as good as Panzer Dragoon Orta was. Now, first of all, let's talk about how this game looks. From an artistic standpoint, it's actually pretty good, and the game is bright and colorful all the time, but the problem is that the frame rate is 30 frames a second. Now, a lot of people might think that the argument about frame rate isn't super important as long as the frame rate is consistent, but I think that 60 frames a second helps a game a lot more, especially if it's an action-focused game like this one is. Any game that's action-focused, where it's like arcadey and fast-paced and requires very quick hand-eye coordination, needs to be 60 frames a second, especially when Rez HD is 60 frames a second and Panzer Dragoon Orta is 60 frames a second. Really, it's just outdated from a visual standpoint. But having played all the way through this game, I can tell you that visually it resembles probably an Xbox 360 launch game or any game that came out within the first 2 years of the Xbox 360. And I guess that's not a huge surprise because the game was originally going to be developed for the Xbox 360 and then they changed it so it would just be on the Xbox One. But I still don't understand why they couldn't just release it on both consoles. I'm also not a fan of console exclusives anyway because that means that fewer people are able to play it, and I want more people to play games in this genre because they're so old school and they're so fun and they're so video gamey and they just don't get old. Now, the cool thing about this game is that you have access to several dragons that you can use and customize. Every time you finish a level, you'll get experience points towards your dragon that you used in that level, and then after that dragon reaches a certain level, you can actually evolve him to the next form of dragon, which is pretty damn cool. The dragons in this game just look awesome. I was only able to get, I think, 6 or so dragons, and I just wanted more. Each dragon differs from each other gameplay-wise in 2 main areas. The first area is in its primary weapon. Every dragon has a primary weapon and a secondary weapon, and the primary weapon cannot be changed. After you've leveled up a dragon a certain number of times, you can actually change their secondary weapon. And the weapon selection is actually pretty cool. You'll have the lock-on lasers that anyone who's played Panzer Dragoon or Rez HD will be familiar with. This is where you move the cursor over a bunch of enemies and just press the attack button, and then a bunch of homing missiles come out, and it's like, boom, dead. But then there are other weapons. There are the slow-firing weapons that do more damage. And then the other useful type of weapon is the one where there's a window, and as long as you hold down the button, the laser will just shoot whatever's in the window. And this gun usually runs out very fast, but it is very useful when you're getting swarmed by enemies. This game also introduces a rock, paper, scissors element when it comes to gameplay. There are 3 elements in the game: fire, light, and wind. And each element is either strong against another one, or weak against another one, or neutral. Fire is effective against wind, fire is neutral against other fire, and fire is not effective against light, for example. Before you start each mission, it will say which enemies are in the mission and what their weaknesses are. So then you can base your dragon selection around that. And then when you're able to customize your secondary weapon on your dragon, you can make it so that your dragon basically has no weaknesses. So they'll go into a level being able to shoot down fire enemies and wind enemies without much problem. The other thing that makes the dragons unique is simply their base stats. Some of the dragons have more agility, which means they're faster, and some of them just have more life, which means they're stronger. Unfortunately, you can't level up these base stats in any way that you want. They're pretty much set from the outset for each dragon. If you're like me, you'll stick with the standard dragon, which is a Crimson Dragon, for most of the game anyway. He's definitely the most well-rounded dragon in the game. And there are other times where you will use the other dragons, but mostly because they have wind elemental attacks or light elemental attacks, and you need something that fire damage just doesn't really do. In Crimson Dragon, you can actually get a wingman to fly with you throughout a level. It's basically another dragon that's either flying right behind you or right in front of you, and if they're flying behind you, they will automatically try to shoot down any enemies that are behind you. But at any time, you can just press up on the D-pad and send him in front of you and start shooting down things that are in front of you. It's super convenient, and there's really no reason not to ever use this because it makes the game easier and a lot less frustrating. The game gives you some of these from the outset, but they have a limited number of uses. In the mission menu, you can actually go to Select Wingman and look at dragons for people that are online. You can select people's dragons online and then use them to help you throughout the levels. This will cost you a certain amount of credits usually, and you really don't want to use them unless you absolutely are having a lot of trouble with the level. And this game does have a shop where you can use in-game credits to buy things that will help you throughout the levels. You can buy item packs, and the easiest way to describe it is that it's like the packages in Mass Effect 3's multiplayer, where you spend a certain amount of credits and you get basically a random group of items. And usually when you spend more in-game credits on these items, you get a higher chance of getting a rare item. And if you ever have the extra credits in this game to do that, please buy these. Now, you'll be spending most of your money in this game buying new dragons whenever they come out. Actually, I take that back. If you're playing it on the classic difficulty, you'll probably be spending a lot of money on regenerators, which give you an extra life through a mission if you die. This game, I think, was just a little too hard on classic difficulty. And if you're going to play this game, I would recommend playing through it on casual. So here's how the controls in this game work. You move the dragon around with the left stick and you aim with the right stick. It's a fairly standard control scheme if you're used to modern games, but games in this genre have never really controlled like this before. They've always controlled with the left stick moving the character and the cursor at the same time, and unfortunately there's no option in the options menu to go back to this more traditional control scheme. And I don't get why. There's no downside to allowing the player to do that. One of the other complaints I have about this game's controls is that you cannot easily turn around when you're flying. I don't mean turn around like go the other direction, I mean just look behind you. In Panzer Dragoon Orta, if you press the left and right triggers at the same time, your perspective would do a 180 and you'd keep flying forward, but you'd be able to look back and shoot the things that were behind you. You can't do that in Crimson Dragon, and I don't understand why. Now, there are certain sections of the game, specifically the boss battles, where you're going to be able to free fly, meaning that you can change direction and go this way, go that way, whenever you want. And in those cases, you can actually press the bumper to turn 90 degrees to the left or 90 degrees to the right. But unfortunately, it's just limited to those sections. Why not have it in the whole game? So the worst thing about Crimson Dragon by far is the mission structure. So usually in this genre, you would have 5 to 10 levels, and they would be linear, but they would be a pretty good length though. They'd be like 10 to 15 minutes, which doesn't sound like that much, but at the same time, you're shooting down stuff all the time, so it's like a very intense 10 to 15 minutes. And this genre is based on the idea that you're going to replay levels over and over again anyway, so it really isn't a problem that a level is only 10 to 15 minutes and there are only 10 levels in the whole game. But the way the levels in this game work is that there are a ton of levels, but each level is like 2 to 3 minutes. There are only 6 areas in the game, and in each area there are 4 or 5 levels each. And the difference between the levels is pretty much just the enemy selection or whether or not there's going to be a boss. And unfortunately, because of the way the levels are designed, the game just feels rushed. There's nothing memorable in any of these levels at all. By comparison, in Panzer Dragoon Orta, in the 4th level, it was called Gigantic Fleet, and you're flying through the sky and you are going solo against this gigantic fleet of all these airships that are trying to shoot you down, and it's just awesome. And then at the end of the level, your dragon becomes critically injured, and then in the next level, you're just running on foot throughout this snowy landscape. If you've played through Panzer Dragoon Orta, you probably still remember that. But there was nothing cool like that in Crimson Dragon. I mean, the levels are just so bland. You just keep hoping that the next level is going to be more interesting than the last one in some way. but it never happens. Another thing that I just didn't care for in this game is that when you're fighting some bosses, there's a timer. This is just an old cliche in these kinds of shooter games that needs to die because there's no reason to have it. I mean, I understand in some games like this, they give you a lower grade if you don't do as well, like if you take too long to beat the boss. But the actual boss fight should end when either you kill the boss or the boss kills you. It shouldn't run out because of some arbitrary timer. When I'm looking forward to a new game in a genre that I like, I look forward to it with the idea of, oh, they're going to get rid of some things that don't work. But for some reason, they kept this in. It's like keeping the life system in Super Mario Bros. What's the point if every level saves your progress? Also, the final boss in this game sucks. The first form of this boss isn't too bad, and the second phase isn't even too bad. But then the boss starts spawning all these cubes that just get in your way, and it's just super frustrating to navigate, and you lose your health so rapidly, even on the casual difficulty. Once you're done with this final boss, you'll be like, okay, I'm never doing that again. It's just frustrating. It's not fun at all. The other big problem with this game doesn't so much have to do with the game itself. It has to do with this thing called Kinect. I am not a fan of this thing. So how exactly does the Kinect work with Crimson Dragon? Voice commands. Seriously? Voice commands? Let's look at two examples of how this game uses voice commands. When you're in the game's menus, you can say things like shop, and the game will go to the shop. Or you can say missions, and the game will go to the mission menu. But I don't understand why anyone would prefer this over using a controller. A controller is faster. And then when you're playing a level and you have a wingman, you can tell the wingman to go in front of you by saying advance forward. And then you can tell him to go behind you by saying fall back. And I just don't see why anyone would use this as an alternative to the controller. When you're using the controller, you just press up on the D-pad to send the wingman forward and down on the D-pad to send the wingman back. It's so easy. Now let's take a look at Child of Eden and how that game used Kinect back in 2011. In that game, using a Kinect would actually change the way that you controlled the game. Your left hand would be doing something and your right hand would be doing something, and it changed the way that you would shoot your lasers and shoot down enemies in the game. Now strangely enough, this game does have a multiplayer mode. The multiplayer in this game is cooperative multiplayer. So the way that the co-op works in this game is that you're basically just playing with a buddy online in the main missions. Your online ally is basically your wingman, so you can fly in front of him and you can fly behind him, whatever you want. And really, if you're going to play all the way through this game, like if you're going to play all the missions, I would say either do it online co-op with a buddy or not at all. As a single player experience, Crimson Dragon just isn't memorable and there's nothing really impressive to say about it. It has cool ideas like leveling up the dragons and customizing weapons and things like that, but it doesn't flesh them out enough. And even though the core gameplay is still pretty fun, like it's still fun to lock onto stuff and shoot them down, it gets old faster in this game because the levels are so repetitive. Really, what we need is Panzer Dragoon Orta in HD. That's basically what I want. I feel like a lot of people, whether they're people that don't play games in the genre or do play games in the genre, are just going to look over this game and gloss over it and think, well, it doesn't look that good. And I hate to say it, but they're right. I love this genre. I love these classic arcade-style shoot-'em-up games, and I love Star Fox 64. I love Res HD. I love Child of Eden on the Xbox 360, and I feel like that was a criminally underplayed game. And unfortunately, Crimson Dragon just does not take this genre to the next level like it should. Better luck next time, developers. I know you can do better than this. I know you can. But until then, I'm just going to wait until Panzer Dragoon Orta HD comes out. Can you please make this in HD? Please. Seriously, if you could just make this in HD.